So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the ALU Center for Arab and Islamic Studies and to our Reimagining Palestine public lecture series. I'm Karima Lashir and I'm the director of the center. I would like first to start by acknowledging the Nunawal and Nambri people of the Canberra region on whose traditional land we meet and work, and pay my respect to all First Nation Australians, their elders, past, present, and emerging. Also acknowledging any Indigenous colleagues and people attending this session this evening. I would like to express my utmost solidarity with Palestinian people in occupied Gaza and the West Bank and all over the world, and solidarity with all impacted communities. And also would like to acknowledge Palestinian staff, students, and colleagues and people attending this meeting today. I hope they are okay, and I hope they are traveling well, given the ongoing horrific onslaught on civilian lives in occupied Gaza and the West Bank. We're very grateful to our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Ala Tartir, whose research on Palestine is pioneering. He will talk to us today about domination in Palestine and the intersection of international aid, security, and state peace building as site of settler-colonial control. We, of course, look forward to a respectful and informative event, and we appreciate this is a very difficult time for many and emotions are high. We would like to stress that it's everyone's responsibility in this event to ensure the cultural safety of this space. We do not tolerate or accept any form of racism or bigotry, and this includes anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinianism, and Islamophobia. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will endeavor to answer as many as we can, given time constraints. And please keep them brief and respectful. Let me offer a brief introduction to our esteemed speaker. Dr. Ala Tartir is Senior Researcher and Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Ala is also a Research Associate and Academic Coordinator at the Geneva Graduate Institute, a Global Fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and a Program and Policy Advisor to Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and also a governing board member of the Arab Reform Initiative. Amongst other positions, Ala worked as a senior researcher and project lead at the Small Arms Survey, and a visiting professor at Sciences Po in France, a fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and a researcher in international development at the LSE, at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he earned his PhD. He is co-editor of Resisting Domination in Palestine, Mechanisms and Techniques of Control, Coloniality and Settler-Colonialism, published last year, and Political Economy of Palestine, Critical Interdisciplinary and Decolonial Perspectives, published in 2021, and Palestine and Rule of Power, Local Dissent versus International Governance. You will find Ala's publications on his website if you are interested to know more about his fascinating work. And with that, Ala, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you. Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Karima, for the kind introduction. It's truly a pleasure and honor to be here today and to be invited to this fascinating series that you've been putting out. It's really highly appreciated effort, and it's really important. And inspired by your inspiring introduction, this is what we need more of. We need to have more of these conversations that matter, conversations that goes to the core of the discussions that we have, if we really care truly about peace and justice and freedom. And thank you so much for all the organizing team and for all the colleagues who's attending today and colleagues in the audience. As discussed, I will be reflecting on sites of settler colonialism and focusing particularly on three sites. One relates to international aid, and second relate to security and security framework that we have there, and then by extension on the state building and peace building approaches as also sites of settler colonialism. And there is some tensions there and some contradictions, but that's intentional and that is by design. So in the structure of my talk obviously has to start with with Gaza. And as I argue here, as Gaza as a mega site of settler colonialism. We see it live in front of our eyes. I'm sure all of us here check the news just before jumping in to see what is happening. And that's a problem by itself. To see that settler colonialism in front of our eyes and failing at the international level to stop that, it's a big problem. So in terms of structure, I would like to start by situating where we are today, bringing Gaza to the center of the discussion, but then take a step back and look at the Oslo triangle, or what I call Oslo triangle, which is a false framework of peace. But why I'm bringing that to the discussion? Because whatever is happening in the occupied Palestinian territory in Palestine is framed over the past 30 years within this Oslo triangle. And then focus more and zoom in more into these three sites of control: aid, security, and state building. And finally, offer a couple of conclusions, or some conclusions, to end this intervention with. I'm really looking forward to engage in the questions and answer session. And please be strict with me, Karima, when it comes to timing, and just let me know, because otherwise I'm afraid I can't keep going. But if I want to start with one message that I would like you to leave with, and yes, jumping to the conclusion right away, it is really simple conclusion. And that conclusion says, as Israeli settler colonial domination persists, so does Palestinian resistance. I truly hope this is not coming as breaking news to anyone, because resistance is a natural reaction to domination and to control. Measure it at your everyday level, or at the macro level, or at the natural, or at the national level. When there is some domination that is unjust, that is in the framing here of settler colonial domination, the natural thing to do is to resist. And when I say resist, it is in the broad sense of the meaning of the word. In the sense, in the Palestinian case, existence per itself is resistance. Getting educated is resistance, and so on and so forth. So it is, in a way, a forced lifestyle, if you like, under Israeli settler colonialism. And the natural thing to do is to resist. And why I'm starting with the word resistance? Because we came to believe, in a way, or we were forced to believe, that resistance is a dirty word. Be careful when you talk about resistance. But let's be clear. Resistance is a natural sense, and this is a natural thing you do when you feel oppressed. And it shouldn't be very difficult to entertain that thought. But let me start with that conclusion. But also, as I mentioned earlier, we're all seeing it in front of our eyes, what is happening in Gaza. I will not show images that we see on a daily basis. And the idea here is not to bring figures and just to show figures. Each figure has a story behind it, as we all know. But just to show the magnitude of what we're witnessing, or what we've been witnessing over the past 10 months. These are figures from the UN, and it shows the magnitude of all the issues that we're facing in Gaza. And I'm not expanding on that. But where I would like to reflect on is really to try to situate where we are now, in the sense that 7th of October, things did not start on the 7th of October. And it's really important to historicize that, but also important to contextualize it. And I'm not going far 100 or 100 years before that. Let's step one day before the 7th of October, step back one day on the 6th of October. And if you remember with me how the Middle East was perceived by US policymakers, by other Western policy spaces, and I'm not exaggerating here, you can read articles in foreign policy magazines out there. There was an argument there on the 6th of October that the Middle East is okay, is relatively safe. Abraham Accords are accelerating. and regional peace is attainable. It's kind of round the corner with all these normalization talks, with the acceleration of Abraham Accords. We're talking about other forces joining this larger regional peace, and the Palestinian question is marginal. It's okay. The status quo is sustained. It's been going on for a long time, and it's okay. That was a day before the 7th of October, which changed the dynamics of the region, but also the world. And why I'm taking 6th of October here as an example is because that exposes the fundamental fragility of the understanding of that region by Western policy spaces. There are fundamental misunderstanding. And that's not because the region is inherently problematic, but because the region is really a stage and a theater for regional and global power dynamics. And we've been seeing it since October until now. And what we've been seeing is not only a war or a local conflict, not even a regional one. It is a global one. It is really a global one. And I hope it is self-evident that it is a global one that can take different forms and different shapes, can be manifested in different spaces, but it is not a local one. And yes, it's tragic. It is very, very tragic what's been going on. But also, it is a defining moment. And I'm not trying here to make an opportunity only out of this crisis, but it is a defining moment because it shaped some fundamental understandings and shaped the existing frameworks. And they came out of major, major sacrifices. So how that opportunity or defining moment will be instrumentalized, it will be instrumentalized in different ways. But if I want to focus on it from a Palestinian perspective, this will be a huge mistake if Palestinians themselves don't gain this opportunity and build on it, despite all the tragic and pain that I'm talking about and feeling. I'm just talking about how this defining moment can be built to rebuild, to recreate, to reimagine a different reality and march towards that regional reality or towards that new reality. And therefore, what we've been seeing and trying to contextualize here, Gaza, we've been seeing an international failure of international law, but also failure of this rules-based world order. And in my opinion, this is the biggest loser. This is the biggest loser because it shows us that we don't have a governing institutions at the global level that are functioning, or they are functioning in certain ways. And that is a big loss for all of us. But why all of this is happening? It's happening because we're dismissing the root causes. And if we keep insisting on dismissing the root causes, we will pave the way for another future war that can be even uglier in its nature. And that's we mastered by now. And when I say we here, I mean us, the international community, Western policy spaces. We mastered maneuvering around the problems. And we do that with excellence. We see the problem, but it's too difficult, too sensitive, too problematic to deal with it. So let's maneuver, let's go around it, but not address it per se. And this is what we've been seeing that. And instead of having the political courage to go and address the root causes, we say, it's a humanitarian issue there. Let's focus on getting these trucks that have been struck in Gaza for these needy people, which again, a distraction from the very, very political core of that issue. So as if all what we've seen in Ukraine and here being with bringing a European focus, as if no lessons were learned from that. So all of that refer to this international failure that we have over and over. And just to conclude this introductory framing, let's say, we see international law being instrumentalized, being politicized, being anything but consistent. So if we really want to bring that world-based or rules-based world order to function, then we need to take our international law seriously and be consistent with that, and also contextualize our understanding of the current events. Yes, it didn't start on the 7th of October. There is 100 years before that. And that matters. It's not history. It doesn't belong to history and museums and all of that. As I will show in a second, the Nakba of 1948 is a daily reality. We see it in Gaza and elsewhere. And if we want to celebrate normative values and legitimacy, let's celebrate them equally everywhere, not only in one spot because of reason or another. And also, we have multiple international institutions that matters at time of war. International Criminal Court and other institutions in The Hague are the address. And we've been seeing more and more instrumentalization of them. I'm not bringing here disjointed pieces of the puzzle to try to make statements or to try to understand what's happening. But if we really care about this global and regional peace, if we care about the idea of true and meaningful peace, we have the ingredients out there. It's the question of, do we use international law in the way we want to use it and we envisage it? Do we care about contextualization? Do we care about normative values? How do we use these international organizations that we've created and so on? And that is the call for action that we need to have. Because what we've seen in Palestine, and I'm sure many of you saw this map before, but why I'm showing it? Because Israel as a settler-colonial entity masters two things: controlling more land and displacing people. This is what happened over the past 100 years, and also this is what happened over the past 100 years too. It's controlling more land, displacing more people. And you might tell me, well, this is history. Why you're taking us back to 1948? Unfortunately, it is not. And the evidence is quite strong out there. Look at all the reports, all the literature that we have there. It's not history. It is present. Here, there's a number of comparisons. I will not go into the details, but I just to illustrate the point. You see how many people were ethnically cleansed from their home, how many people were forcibly expelled from their home. And that's a comparison between 48 and 2024. Very unfortunate that similar, almost similar results and similar outcome, but not surprising when you think about the nature of the state of Israel as a settler colonial entity. You see that expulsion happening over the years. You see more and more of these comparisons as ongoing destructions, where in 48 we saw 50% of Palestinian villages and towns depopulated. Now we see over 70% of housing in Gaza being destroyed. We see ongoing massacres as a tool that's been used in 1948 and the tool that's being used in today's presence. And we see ongoing colonization, which is in the DNA. It's in the structure of the nature of the state. So if you compare these cases, and the Led here, or Ledia is where I'm originally coming from, whatever my grandmother told me about their journey from 1948 until they were expelled to Ramallah, what they witnessed in 1948, I see it here on the left-hand side of this slide, but on the other side, I see it as of today on Gaza. And this is not to victimize the whole thing. It is just to say there is a structure, there is design. It is happening by design. It's not random, and it is not coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of a plan. It's coming out of a structure. It's coming out of a design. And here are a number of quotes that we have there to testify and illustrate why this is happening. So keep that in mind. Keep that larger picture in mind, and that's focused mainly on Gaza. But if you look at other parts of Palestine, for example, the West Bank, this year, like 2023, and until now, being the most deadly years since the Second Intifada. And that's, yes, breaking news to stop at. There is no way to compare what's happening in the West Bank in comparison with what's happening in Gaza. We're talking about different scale, different magnitude. But still, it matters when you have number of casualties more than any time since 2005 as of today. Then we need to ask what's going on. And we need to remember lots of conversations about the hostages in Gaza, but there are over 9,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. So if we want to be objective in that sense, if we want to really look at this story in the two equations of it, let's let these facts speak out to us and put them there. And therefore, what is crucial to me here is let's go to that kind of DNA that I talked about. Let's problematize and talk about the nature of the one state reality that we have there. We have there between the river to the sea. There is one state reality. The important question is, what is the nature of that one state reality? The moment we start genuinely addressing that question and answering that question in a true meaning way, then actually that could lead us to finding some solutions. And that could lead us to addressing these root causes instead of maneuvering around them. Because when you look at that one state reality, this is an illustration of that one state reality. I don't know if you came across such a map. This is actually the West Bank that being celebrated everywhere as a state, the state of Palestine. It was recognized a couple of times. You have 140 plus countries recognizing the state of Palestine. You have a whole Palestinian Authority going out there hailing and talking about the state and how we built it and how the Palestinians are all there in terms of readiness for statehood. But this is the state. All these disjointed, fragmented pieces of land. This is the West Bank in reality. It's not a continuous piece of land where there is sovereignty, there is independence. And I'm showing this because there is this creation of image that there is a Palestinian state out there. Go to the West Bank, this is what you see. Fragments of islands. So when we talk about realities, we really need to get to these levels of details to really visualize it and imagine it and reimagine it. Because what we see is full Israeli control on Palestinian daily life. Here are a couple of examples, but it is full control. And that's what it means to have one state reality, despite all the talk about the Oslo peace process, despite all the talk about two-state solution, mediation, and so on and so forth. We have one dominant power controlling. So that whole site, river to the sea, is a site of control. And this power, this control is manifested in different ways. In Gaza, we see it how it is manifested today. In the West Bank, we see these fragments, how it is manifested today. In Israel and in 1948 territories, we see other manifestations like the structures of apartheid and racial discrimination as being documented by so many reports out there. So what we see there is what I call an ugly triangle of settler colonialism, of apartheid, and of continued occupation. And within that, this is what frames the Palestinian life. So 3 sides of control, 3 sides of dominations. What do you expect them to do? To push back, to resist. And that's where the framing matters. And this is why I'm trying to put it on the table for further discussion, because that matters. On the other hand, if you look at what the Palestinians been doing, and here when I talk about Palestinians, I'm talking more from a policy space. You have 2 authorities. You have a Palestinian Authority and you have Hamas in Gaza, being fragmented, being causing harm to the Palestinian national movement for many years. Both of them are equally responsible. Yes, it is time of war and resistance now, so maybe it's not time to talk about them. No, but they are part of the issue, both of them. And this is part of the political courage to talk about both of them and how both of them are causing harm or being causing harm for the Palestinian struggle, and to make the Palestinians closer to their liberation and to their freedom by being fragmented. You have 2 different approaches from a Palestinian side, and that cause damage in the sense that you have a Palestinian Authority nominally controlling the West Bank and celebrating the statehood that is obsessed by the idea of statehood. It's all statehood, regardless if that is the right avenue or not. They've been following this avenue for 30 years. And the state is anything but closer. The state is further away than any time before. Still, there is insistence, there is an obsession with this idea of statehood. And there is fixation of this idea of two-state solution, as if we need additional evidence that it is obsolete. It's just not working. It's not delivering peace. It's not delivering two states. It's making things worse and worse and worse for the Palestinians, because it is sustaining the status quo. And sustaining the status quo is not good news for the Palestinians, but it's good news for many other actors. And that's important to keep in mind when we talk about why the status quo is sustained, because the international community created this Palestinian Authority, sustained it through aid, as I will come to that, and are insisting that it stays there to function. Now, to function in what sense? That's a different story. Is it to function to get the Palestinians closer to their liberation and freedom, or to function to secure this framework of two-state solution, to secure the Oslo Accords? And what does that mean? It means securing the framework, offering security to Israel at the expense of the Palestinian security. And I come to that in a second. So what we've been seeing over the years is this high level of cooperation between the colonized and the colonizers through the Palestinian Authority institutions, and the framing of statehood and obsession with that statehood as the only way to go to their meaning, to get the Palestinians to self-determination. And for that, they've been struggling. The Palestinian Authority, most likely you've seen in the news, there is always a permanent financial crisis, there is a political crisis, there is desperate need for relevance. They just want to be relevant in all what's going on in the region. So not to stay relevant to these different discussions. And for that, they did whatever was requested from them. And yes, I'm trying to simplify things here, but in order to stay relevant, they gave in for all forms of conditionality. And therefore, it is after 30 years of the existence of this bureaucracy, national body that is dominant in the West Bank with its public servants, with its institutions, but more importantly, with its security forces, it is really important now, after 30 years, to question the institutional utility of the Palestinian Authority as a tool and as an avenue for self-determination and freedom. If you ask Palestinians in the streets, if you ask Palestinian opinion polls, you see their opinion is very clear. It's very clear that this is a burden rather than an avenue for freedom. So that's one side from the Palestinian side. But the other side, it's been from Hamas side. When we look at the different program, Hamas carries a different program, counter to the one of the Palestinian Authority and of the one of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Different program, different liberation strategy, different resistance strategy. But also, Hamas been going through major transformations over the years as a political actor here. And I'm focusing here on the political actor side, because Hamas accepted the Oslo framework. They ran the elections in 2006. They won the elections, and it was democratic, transparent elections. And I always stop there and add a footnote here. Let's imagine if we in the West, if the international community respected the results then. I argue that we will not see what's happening now in Gaza. We will have avoided all these wars in Gaza over the years. And it wasn't hard. It was accepting democracy. It was accepting transparency. This is what the Palestinian people wanted. Palestinians don't go intervene in Australia if they elect X government or Y government. They don't go intervene in wherever other countries if they. So can we respect that? You know, someone could argue. And I think that would have changed things. Of course, Hamas now, after 7th of October, is going through different process that is not clear where it will go to, depending on the outcome of this war, where it one of the outcomes could be that Hamas would go and join the PLO, for example, or other scenarios that we can come back to. So this is a defining moment for Hamas. But all what I'm trying to testify here or just illustrate is that we have these two different views that are important to keep in mind even when we talk about Gaza today, when we talk about Palestinian politics, but when we talk about how Palestinians are facing and confronting that triangle that I talked about. But regardless of all the changes or all the differences between Hamas and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and Fatah, both of them function within another triangle. And I'm sorry if I have so many triangles, but it helps me in visualizing things. They've been maneuvering or not even maneuvering, they've been framed within another triangle, which I call here the Oslo Framework Triangle. And this is an old one, 30 years old structure, framework. And that framework did structural changes at many levels, social levels, political levels, economic levels. And unfortunately, it's not old news. It is still ongoing news in the sense it is relevant. It is relevant because that framework, which let's say that Oslo framework is relevant, although it is obsolete, it is not getting any closer to the two-state solutions, but that's not the point. The point is about the structural changes, about the sides of control that it created over the years, that been solidified over 30 years of time, which makes flipping this structure or this framework or this triangle harder job because of all the entrenchments of these changes that happen. What Oslo did, the Oslo framework, it changed the social contract's dynamics. It redefined that social contract. It distorted, fragmented the Palestinian people, shrank them, and distorted them. And if we look at the economic sides, it didn't create any independent Palestinian economy. It only created dependency. It created structures that are dependent on international aid. It denied Palestinian development. And if you look at the political side of the equation, it created a corrupt style of governance, authoritarian in nature, and anything but democratic. And these changes are not random. They are by design. They are structural ones. And this is why they keep going and going and being entrenched. And this is what this recipe of Oslo, why it is problematic, because it created that framework, but it also brought the tools with it. And in this book, the latest one, the Resisting Domination in Palestine, we talk about some of these tools, some of these mechanisms for control and for sustainability of colonial dominance. And I invite you to check the chapters in that book. But the issue here is that these mechanisms are very clearly designed to sustain that framework. And anything that tries to shake that framework is big news. And this is why 7th of October made it, because that was the framework that it wanted and it desired to challenge. Because the framework of Oslo created security arrangements to protect Israel as occupying forces at the expense of the Palestinian rights. It sustained the permanent crisis of the status quo. It created a process of negotiation just for the sake of the process and sustainability of the process, but not for the process to deliver. It sustained the status of dependency. It created a bureaucracy that is not functional and inflated and a burden on the Palestinian people. But importantly, and look at the West Bank now, it created structural authoritarianism. And again, by design, because the tools are there, the security forces are there. And therefore, the notion of resistance was criminalized because this is not what you do when you collaborate and when you cooperate, i.e., when you're controlled. And therefore, the very meaning of peace became extremely distorted. And that's where that's where this Oslo Accords and its Oslo recipe tended to create this feeling that there is securitization of everything apart from one thing, which is the security of the Palestinian people. So that's the framework that both Hamas and Palestinian Authority functions within and frame their work, in addition to other lots of challenges that I will not go through now. But I want to take the remaining time to also zoom in a little bit on these, let's say, two or three sides of dominations and control and how they've been instrumentalized. One of them relates to the international aid, and one of them to the security framework and the security paradigm. And why I'm taking these two? Because these two are defining features of the overall framework that is still dominating the scene, which is, again, the Oslo framework scene. So when we talk about international aid, we talk about over $50 billion US dollars went to that international aid business and industry in the occupied Palestinian territory. 50 billion. That's a large figure when you look at its percentage of the GDP, when you look at its percentage per capita, but not large enough when you look at the American military aid to Israel. But let's put that on the side. And let's keep the focus on these 50 billion. How did they distort all of that? How come 50 billion in a small economy with a small number of people were not able to deliver? And instead, my argument there was a tool to discipline the Palestinians, to criminalize them, to silence them in order not to push the boundaries. And therefore, not trying to be too academic here, but I worked in this domain of international aid for the past many years. And if we want to look at the impact of that international aid, what is the impact of these $50 billion, we can understand that through different approaches, or through 4 different schools of thought, or 4 different framings. And one of them, what we call here the instrumentalists approach, is that it's an approach, think of the World Bank, for example. They say, okay, well, these were good money in the sense that they were an investment in peace. And it's a sound model. It should be maintained. But maybe let's fix the Palestinian Authority, and that will help in addressing failures. There is no talk about the context. It's a tool. There is a gap. Let's bring this money. It finances that gap. Let's think of it as an investment in peace. And if anything happens, it's not the policy or the framework to blame. It is the Palestinian Authority, the national authority here in that case. So that's what we call the instrumentalists. And this is the dominant approach that we see. We have a second one, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll go quickly about them, but there is a second one which is a bit more critical. Still, they share the idea that actually the framework is okay, the policy is fine, but the structure around that, the reality of the occupation, is the main obstacle to peace. But they stop there. They declare it as if they are analysts, but they don't say, okay, how do we confront that reality, that obstacle? And they don't question anything else other than it is a critical take on things, but it contributes to the sustainability of the status quo. But what we've been seeing over the past decades, and here more centered from a Palestinian point of view, is what we call here the critics, that they see this tool, which is aid, as a tool to silence Palestinians, to criminalize their resistance, to deny their development, to sustain the status quo of occupation, to see development as a technical exercise, not as a political one. So they've been critical of this aid industry because it's making the Palestinians weaker and less developed. They see the process of development in reverse. But finally, There is a fourth school of thought that arguably now, if you look at Gaza and think of all issues related to aid, it is the dominant one, or what we call here the neo-colonialists. In the sense, actually, aid to Palestinians was a success. These 50 billions were not a failure. They were success because they offered stability, they offered security, in particular here for the settler-colonial project of Israel, and it offered economic incentives, so to give up political rights. It criminalized resistance and equalized it with terrorism and so on and so forth. And that is a dominant discourse now where you see it out there in the structures. So that's how these aid became structure or a site of control. Of course, there have been lots of attempts to push back and resist that, but maybe we can reflect on that later. But my idea is to focus more on these sites of control. And so was this security framework that I talked earlier about, which is a security framework that I found this chart or this illustration quite telling about, and summarizing it quite neatly, although sadly, what does it mean? It means that you subcontract repression. You subcontract it to a national authority in that sense. And I'm not trying here to distract from the larger picture. No, I'm trying to bring these examples that sustain this larger picture. And that framework is one. And how this is sustained? It is sustained through all the security personnel. In Palestine, there, on average, or as a ratio, we have one security personnel for 48 people. This is one of the highest percentages in the world. We have over 80,000 working in the security sector, defined in a broad sense. I think we have so many brigadier generals there than many other large countries. But again, that was by design. And again, no wonder why you have almost 15 security establishments out there to host all these security personnel to sustain that framework. Here, I'm not trying to be critical of the national authorities per se, but I'm trying to show the imposition, how these structures were imposed on them as a way to say, this is what state building is all about. You create the institutions, but they didn't ask if these institutions are the right institutions or the wrong institutions. If these are the institutions that the Palestinian wants, and they think they would get them closer to freedom, or are they the exact opposite? They are the wrong institutions that solidify this control and domination, which happens after all these 30 years. So what to do with all of that? Of course, it is easier to say it rather than do it, but it is really about reversing that Oslo triangle. There is no easy process or straightforward or linear process, because as I mentioned, 30 years created lots of entrenchments, lots of dependency. But inspired by the title of the series here, Reimagining. Yes, let's imagine and reimagine different reality where instead of security and securitization in the center, let's bring accountability to the picture and let's bring people to the picture, because neither of them are featured. And we're not featured in all my 40 minutes discussion so far, people and accountability. So if we really want transformation towards peace, these two elements are key. And once we center them, we center accountability, we center people, then we start thinking differently about the political system, about the governance model that should rule, and then think differently about what kind of legitimate, effective, representative leadership that is needed. And once we have these ingredients there and right and instrumentalized in a way that contribute to peace, then we can redefine peace as it's been distorted in its meaning and its original meaning over the past 30 years. And this is how I see we can, at least conceptually here, reverse that. But it's not only conceptually, because there are already a number of tools that we can use to operationalize this. And the tools that we can operationalize this is a relatively long list, but it requires a real workshop. It's not the time for it maybe now with the war and with all what's happening in Gaza, but we can start with elements of it. And unfortunately, that site of control in Gaza will be another site for action post-war, how it can be used to help in a process of flipping that chart, that triangle, in order not to see another October and not to see another war on that side of control. No scarcity of ideas. You have new Palestinian intellectual and political leadership they want to strategize differently. They want to plan differently. They think differently. They belong to a new era, not an old era. There is a new narrative, new discourse. We see it with Gaza, with the war, but also we see different narrative coming from different generations. We see multiple attempts to address fragmentation. We see multiple attempts to confront securitization and authoritarianism, and even the aid modality that's been there. But importantly, and I end with this, we see multiple processes to engage with institutions that matter, to bring institutions of the Palestinians that represent them all. I know I took lots of time. I'm sorry if I took you to different directions, but I wanted to put on the table these signs of control and how they can be discussed and contextualize what's happening now in all of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ala. That was extremely illuminating and very informative and mind-blowing. We're extremely grateful. Thank you so much for taking us through in a very lucid way through your argument. We're very, very grateful. I will ask the audience to post on their questions, but I have a question for you to start with, Ala, if you don't mind, please. Could you further elaborate on the comparison between the state building and settler-colonial models for understanding Palestinian politics and the economy, or the flaws in the state building framework compared to the settler-colonial perspective? Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Thank you very much. I mean, the main question or the main tension that I have there, what kind of state can you build there within the presence of settler-colonial projects? So how do you address that tension and that contradiction, which also a contradiction of how can you build peace with settler-colonial being present? And my counter argument is that you need to start and engage in a process of decolonization instead of state building. And this is where the focus and the obsession of the Palestinian polity here to engage in process of state building rather than dismantling the structures of powers, and they are structures of settler-colonial entity. Instead of that, the idea was how to live with them, how to as if there is a separation between that's a project, but we have our own project, which is a state building project. And meanwhile, let's talk about peace building as a way. But my main issue in terms of comparison is how to reconcile that. How can you have settler colonialism as entity, as structures, as mechanisms, and at the same time, you mask that reality of settler colonialism as a state building project is possible. And this is when that state building and peace building project hit the wall big times after it reached the peak in 2011 and 2012, because that was the ceiling. That was the ceiling that the settler colonial entity allowed you to get into. Yes, which was institutions that are functioning better, that they look more modern, the security forces are looking better, are better equipped. So it's really the ceiling that a settler colonial entity can force. And then what happened? Do you live with that ceiling and then you try to enhance the conditions of that space, or do you push these boundaries and create a new framework?
Fantastic. Thank you, Ala. I've got 3 questions on the Palestinian Authority. The first one, where does the Palestinian Authority stand regarding the realities of settler colonialism in Palestine? And what do you think? I mean, the official PA narrative seems to be fixated on a 2-state solution and maintaining PA governance in part of the West Bank. How do you view the PA's role, and what do you foresee for its future? So I don't know whether you want to take the questions together, Ala. The second question,
try. Yeah.
It's related to PA as well, to the Palestinian Authority. In the current crisis, is it realistic to seek to displace the Palestinian Authority and rebuild the PLO as a basis for a new Palestinian state? In the short to medium term, would that not further fragment and destabilize the Palestinian cause? Thank you, Ala. I have a third one, but maybe you can start with these 2 and I'll go into the third one. Thank you so much.
Great. No, thanks. Thank you so much for the excellent questions. Let me start with the last question about the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and if that is a good idea or a bad idea. I argue it is a good idea if it is done right, in the sense that the first thing to do now is to continue in having this national dialogue at the Palestinian side to revive the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Don't get me wrong, this institution is rusty, it's obsolete, it's not functional, the PLO, but it doesn't mean it cannot be revived. And it means, what I'm arguing here is that it should be revived because it gained lots of international legitimacy, but it's not inclusive. And if you go back to where I started with, thinking of what's happening now as a political opportunity, this is the political opportunities for the Palestinians to get their act together. In the sense, bring Hamas and Islamic Jihad to this umbrella after a national dialogue to agree what is the Palestinian political program. It doesn't mean that the Palestinians need to be unified in their vision and in their approach. There is no such thing anywhere in the world, but they agree on these disagreements. They agree on what kind of tools they have and how they function. Because if that PLO stays out there, but not functioning and not representative and not inclusive, then what is the point? And this is where if the Palestinians want to build their base of power, this is unity in that sense. Hamas and Islamic Jihad gets invited to the PLO, be part of that overall structure. And that will not be as a process because you will have so many actors pushing back. But this is the battle. It's another battlefield. How the Palestinians insist that this is what is needed. And there are multiple attempts happening now, some promising ones, but there is lots of resistance. Resistance also from Palestinian factions, including the Palestinian Authority, because it shakes lots of fundamental pillars that have been developed over the years. But that is the address. If you ask me what is the address, it's a national dialogue to revive this institution and make it work. Now, where to lead to, it's a different story. Is it real state or not state? Maybe we take more incremental approach. Maybe it's more self-determination, freedom, rights, equal rights. So that's, for me, a question that comes a bit later. It is part of the framing. It is part of what is the end goal, but it is really incremental, step by step, where we get to what the Palestinian factions want. So that's in relation to the PLO and if it is the right address or not and how to do it. On the critical questions in relation to the role of the Palestinian Authority, it is obviously a complex one because the only approach that the Palestinian Authority sees is the two-state solution, regardless of its fundamental deficiencies, because they don't see that. It's the framework, and I argue it is actually a solution if it is possible to do it. But why we failed as globe, as the world, why did we fail to implement that? Because as someone who spent my first 25 years of my life there, that's the only thing that I could see, because it's just easy. You know, it's like you put the Palestinians here, you put the Israelis there, and you see what happens in the future. That's a different story, but that's the easier one. That's the easier solutions. And I argue it is possible to do it, but if we have political will, if we have accountability mechanisms, and if we have implementation mechanisms that we're able to do. What we've been seeing over the years are frameworks, but without real accountability mechanisms that ensure that a two-state solution could be there. But from a Palestinian Authority point of view, this is the only way. Following the elections of 2005, it's not only the only way, it is the only way, but also resistance has to be in a certain way. And anything that doesn't go in the framework of the allowed resistance will be criminalized. This is why we saw a major security sector reform project in the West Bank. So therefore, this is the structure that the Palestinian Authority can function within. If that changes, then that changes their duties, that changes their mandate. And then that means they will lose lots of the benefits that they have there. What I'm trying to say is, unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority is part of the problem and is seen as subcontractor to the occupation. And that subcontracting of repression does not help the Palestinian to get closer to their freedom. And then the question of the future of the PA depends on which variables we're bringing in which direction we want to have. But the important thing to keep in mind that the international community will not let the Palestinian Authority go easily, because it's an instrument for them. Whenever we hear about financial talks, like, oh, it's about to collapse. No, they make it get there, but not collapse. And then there will be a rescue mission. Why? Because it's a tool. And why? Because it is part of the settler equation, larger settler equation that we have there. They don't perceive Israel as settler-colonial entity. They perceive it as partner to work with. And here, this is why the vast majority of the Palestinians don't see the Palestinian Authority or its leadership as legitimate. And again, this is not breaking news. Look at the different opinion polls and surveys there. They know, Palestinians know that they are not represented. But the Palestinian Authority has the tool to suppress, to make sure that they stay in power, as in many other countries of authoritarian rule. Sorry, it's a bit convoluted, maybe answer, but it's a complex question to capture.
Beautifully answered. Thank you, Ala. It's really very well explained. Another question related to that. And by the way, they all thank you and for such a fantastic lecture. So I cut that. I just go straight to the question for the time, because of the time limit. So regarding post-war government, do you see any future way out of the political legitimacy problem wherein Hamas' 2006 electoral victory was unacceptable at the time per the quartet principles, between quotation marks? Hamas' return to electoral politics is scarcely conceivable now, and yet it would seem foolish for external parties to support another chapter of externally patronized, unelected PA governance after this year. And the last point, the resignation in February of PA Prime Minister Steyer seems newly authentic internal demonstrations of the PA untenability. So I think it's more like a comment to a question, but how do you see the post-war governance happening on the ground, given the fact that Hamas, there seems to be a push to exclude Hamas? I suppose that's the gist of the question, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for another excellent question, another difficult one, because we don't know what will happen in the post-war if we're talking about even the governance of Gaza, if we talk about the day after Gaza. We know the different views, we know the different perspectives. We know we have a strong push that let's eliminate Hamas, which is very delusional in so many ways. And then we see other push, actually, no, let's engage with Hamas and let's bring them to the Palestinian house, in the sense of bringing them to the PLO as also a way of protecting Hamas. And here I'm not talking only Hamas as a political entity or as a government. No, I'm talking about a political stream, if you want, that is popular amongst the Palestinians. If elections happen today, in the West Bank, Hamas would win the elections. Maybe it's not, I don't know, in Gaza, but the popularity of Hamas is within the Palestinians, and therefore the legitimacy of Hamas is important to keep in mind, because if elections happen today, they might win. And then how policy circles will react to that. Will they do the same as 2006, or they accept the Palestinian democracy? Because also it is very rare to happen. Palestinian democracy happened twice over the last 30 years. So when it happens, gain from it. Don't just dismiss it, because this is what the Palestinians want. But in terms of what kind of governance mechanism, especially in the day after, here we open up the questions to so many different scenarios, and it will be, lots of that will be determined by how the war ends, in the sense of what kind of illustrations of power, of victory, of dominance we have in the aftermath of the war. A main stage for that will be manifested in any kind of post-war reconstruction process, because that will be another battlefield. And then who governs that? So you go at that, even at that level, before going at the larger national level. There will be many attempts to bring the Palestinians through different conversations of reconciliations and unity that even got all the way to China to get them together. So that's part of the attempts, or multiple attempts, to get some answers to what to do with the day after and what to do with the governance structures, because as you rightly said, the existing ones are not perceived legitimate, and that is part of the problem. The legitimacy of the different governing bodies, even of Hamas before the war, was very problematic. And then what to do with that? And the answer to do with that is to engage in a national dialogue, to agree on the broad lines of what are the tools and what is the overall framework, and how to agree on these differences when it comes to security and on governing bodies. But the game is beyond the Palestinian control, in the sense it's not only the Palestinians can control where it goes. It is regional, it is global. You see different regional actors trying to push into in one direction, international actors in the other directions. So the whole area is a site of contention, but also a site of manifestation of power. And each actor wants to manifest their power in a different way. And that's where it's another form of war, it's another form of battles, but it exists because that's a battle of existence, but also a battle of what kind of positions you want to take and implement as political programs.
Yes, I completely agree. I think it's very fascinating when you said it's not Israel-Hamas war as it's always portrayed. It's more like a global issue and global war. Thank you, Ala. There are quite a few questions on aid. So the first one, why do you think there is a persistent insistence by donors and the PA on maintaining the existing aid model? What would it take for this model to evolve to better reflect the realities on the ground in light of your presentation today and your broader work? And I think if you can tackle that one, there is another one about civil society and donors. What role could Palestinian civil society and NGOs play in the post-PA future, and have Palestinian civil society been co-opted by donors? I mean, it's kind of related, more or less. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these aid-related questions. Okay, let me start with an equation. If I want to summarize the equation of international aid over the past 30 years, and this is not my equation, it's established in the literature, there is one equation that summarizes the aid business in Palestine. And the equation says, in the aid business, the US decides, the World Bank leads, the EU pays, the UN feeds, and Israel destroys. repeat, and repeat, and repeat. And this is what's been happening over the past 30 years. And I know the Palestinians are not mentioned in that equation, but that's for another conversation, to what extent they are agents for change, to what extent they are recipients and all that. But keep that equation in mind. And that equation, if that equation persists to stay, then we know we're maneuvering within that cycle of repeating that equation. And why? Because it is convenient. It is the well-trodden way. It's convenient. It relieved all these actors from political guilt because they think, well, we're supporting Palestine. We're supporting the establishment of the state of Palestine. And maybe that's good enough. That's what we call the economic peace. They don't have the courage to move from being a payer into a player. And this is particularly relevant to the European countries and the EU in particular. So why that model exists? Because it is in line with the Oslo framework. It is in line with what the World Bank, and this is why the World Bank is part of the equation. In 1993, they produced this massive volume, 6 volumes of something called Investment in Peace. Go and check it. It's kind of the roadmap for how to use the Oslo framework as an avenue to build the state. And it dictated this whole aid framework, and it continues to be. So anything that tries to shake that equation or question it or problematize it is causing headache, is causing problems, because you're bringing accountability to that equation. You're bringing the questions of do no harm principles, and is this aid causing harm or not? And here, of course, we need to segregate what kind of aid we're talking about. I mean, if it is just for humanitarian aid, filling the gaps, or developmental aid, or politicized aid, because all aid is conditional. It is a matter of how do you deal with that level of conditionality. And therefore, that framework exists because it is in line with the political framework. And the moment the political framework differs, and you have a different political framework, different political parameters, different ways of engaging with the questions of one state reality, then the donors will start questioning their intervention and asking, maybe we're doing harm. Many of them are asking that questions on a daily basis, and they know the answer. They know it very, very well. And these policy makers and aid workers, they know the answer, but they are confronted with a political framework that they need to contribute to sustain it. Because imagine if the donors are not there, who will sustain that framework? And therefore, this is why that framework is sustained and is working and is sustaining the status quo. And yes, when it comes to the civil society and the non-governmental organization and the NGOization of the space, that's an issue in the sense that this is what aid dependency created. It created a large sector of the NGO who are dependent on the aid money, and to exist, to work, they need that aid money. So that's part of the aid dependency. But it doesn't mean that the whole Palestinian civil society is accepting that, is dependent on that. No. And this is where we move to the sides of resistance. You see so many attempts from the civil society, and it's actually only coming from the civil society, to push back against that framework of aid, to expose it, to problematize it, to show and illustrate how damaging and how problematic it is. And really, there are multiple initiatives there led by the civil society to question that aid, to bring accountability to it. It doesn't mean that they have the easy life, but it means they got the right approach to question that instead of contributing to its sustainability as we see it.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you so much. There's a question on the Palestinian political dynamics, and it says, given the unprecedented changes on the ground, such as the genocide in Gaza and the accelerated control over the West Bank, what is the path forward for Palestinian politics? What role, if any, does the PLO have in the future? And I think you dwelt on that for a bit, if you can, yeah.
But this is really another very important question, because, and this is why I keep insisting that what we're seeing now is a political opportunity, and that's not from a trying to theorize things, but trying to be actually practical about it. Because what else Palestinian politics and Palestinian governance need to change course, to start thinking differently after this game changer that happened? Because what's been happening over the past years is, again, shaking so many assumptions and questioning so many assumptions that was there, but also going directly into this imbalances of power that we have that exists there. And therefore, from a Palestinian politics point of view, the main point is to start that internal workshop. Maybe not to start, maybe to continue that internal workshop, but with different parameters, taking into consideration what happened over the past 10 months. Because what happened before, all these reconciliation talks, all these different conversations are one thing, but then what happened over the past 10 months is something else that should inform and impact and direct what will happen next. And then what will happen next is how to engage in this dialogue, first to keep the Palestinians there, to keep the Palestinian body, to keep the Palestinian people, before we talk about politics. Because what we see as a settler-colonial entity, the main issue is to erase Palestinians from presence. And you see it very visible in our eyes in Gaza. So the responsibility of these political factions is to unify in that position, that this is what we're doing as political actors, to protect our presence, our identity, our resistance in the sense of being there, in the sense of existence. So that's really, it might sound very basic, but actually we're talking about existential threat. And this is where these political factions need to be up for that, by saying this is the priority, and then start having different conversations about the national dialogue, about the governance, about different modality. It is very clear that the structures, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, the structures of governance, the modality of governance didn't work in the sense that it didn't create any Palestinian legitimate factors. It didn't empower the Palestinians to get closer to their freedom. And then these are two fundamental defining features if that governance model is delivering or not. No, it's not the normal life there that you just need to have an institution that is functioning and delivering public service and it is working. No, that's not the point. The point, if these institutions can get the Palestinians closer to their freedom, full stop. That's what it is. This is what is like, why bureaucracies are needed, why institutions are needed. Not to celebrate the institutions per se and say, oh, they are transparent, they are functioning, they can deliver. You can get your passport in 1 day. You can get your ID in 2 days. You can get whatever. Yes, that's part of it. But the main thing, if you have the right institutions to change the power balances and to make the Palestinians closer to realizing their self-determination. And this is the struggle of any nation within the settler-colonial project, to transform these sites of control into sites of resistance to sites of freedom. This is the way, the equation, how I see it and how it goes. And this is why I'm questioning the institutional utility of all these institutions and governance structures, because that is the ultimate objectives to have there. So long story short, this is the time for Palestinian factions to get their action together, despite all the resistance to that. And this is where the civil society, and going back to the former question, can play a larger role to put pressure on these structures, to accountability pressures, to really engage in a conversation that matters, and not only go to Moscow and to Beijing and elsewhere and have nice photo opportunity and talk, but then say, oh, well, we didn't have time to talk about action plans. What did you talk about? Are you political analysts going there to talk about the political? And you're going there to make a roadmap. This is the politician, your role as political institution, as a national movement. So it's a long workshop, but it is quite clearly defined in the sense of what is needed. But it requires pressure. It requires accountability mechanisms in order to deliver.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you so much. There's a question about human capital in Palestine. Now, with your hat as the political economist, could you comment on the state of human capital in Palestine? Donors and institutional state-building agendas often neglect this critical dimension. How is the ongoing war likely to impact Gaza's human capital in the long term? And what strengths or weaknesses exist in the West Bank and other parts of Palestine?
Well, thank you. This is a call, I take it from this question, to center people, to center human capital. And this is also what I've been trying to do through my work. Instead of centering the wrong institution, the institution center the people in the discussion. Use them as your reference point, but also as your starting point. Because donors focused a lot on institutional settings, on institutional efficiencies, on building these institutional bodies, which, you know, I see the valid point, taking into consideration what I said earlier, but that was not by focusing on the people and on their resilience and on their presence, but also on their capabilities and capacities to enhance these capabilities and enhance these capacities, and meaning empowering them in the true sense, not in the liberal sense. In the true sense, they are empowered to resist, to push back. And for me, that goes back, and thanks for your questions, for how do we understand development in the first place? Donors tend to understand development here as a technical issue, maybe economic growth, but not as a bottom-up approach that brings people to the center, that it takes into consideration all these structures of power, but also the way development, and when we center human capital in the middle of that, it should be understood as a process that is that seeks to liberate people, human capital, from dependency and humiliation. And this is an emancipatory process that frees them from poverty, inequality, fear, oppression, and empower them to be free, to cultivate their lands, to exercise their options, to expand their options, to expand their potentials, to expand their capabilities. And this is how I understand development when human capital is centered in there. What is human capital after all? Are we talking about education? Are we talking about the skills that they carry and the value of the human being at the end of the day? So if you look at the donor intervention, and finally linking it with your question, 30% of the funding didn't go to these people. It went to the security establishment, 30%. And that's not enhancing or empowering people or their capabilities or the human capital. The education sector, the health sector combined didn't get up to 20% of that aid. Not to mention the agriculture sector, which is very important, not even 1%. So that's the issue with the design of the structure, that it didn't bring the human capital to the center, but rather the institutions and the wrong institutions. And this is not only the fault of the donors, but the fault of the framework, the fault of the absence of a Palestinian leadership that take these questions seriously, because development is a process, and as any process, it requires a legitimate, effective leadership to go through that process and to build that. And if that's not the case, then it becomes technical exercise and becomes dominant by external powers, but not by the Palestinians themselves.
Thank you, Anna. One more question, please, on the future of the Palestinian liberation movement. Is it global or local? Given the current momentum within the movement, do you believe it is sustainable in the long term? Additionally, considering the fragmented nature of the Palestinian leadership, what strategies could potentially sustain this momentum?
So I missed the last part, the second part of the question.
So
the sustainable.
Additionally, considering the fragmented nature of the Palestinian leadership, what strategies could potentially sustain this momentum?
Thank you. It is global in the sense of when we talk about Palestine, Palestine only half of the Palestinians are in Palestine. The other half is in Shatat, in the diaspora. So this is just makes the whole question of Palestine by definition a global definition, because the Palestinians are not there. They are not in their homes. They are fragmented elsewhere. And that's the power of the diaspora and the power of the Shatat. And the globe and Palestine has been and always been a global issue. It's not a Palestinian issue. It's not an Arab issue. It's not a regional issue. It is a global by definition. And what we've been seeing since October until now in all these public spaces, from universities to the streets around the world, it shows very clear that this is a public issue. And honestly, that is a source of hope amidst all the pain and the escalating pain, to see all these all this level of support that is still not making it to the policy spaces, not making it to the right international governance institutions, because they are fundamentally problematic. But we're talking about, if it is a global issue, it is a global issue. And I've always argued that the moment we have global governance institutions that are able to deliver what? Deliver peace, then the Palestine question would be really tackled. And that would be an ultimate test for our global governance institutions, if they function or not. And this is why they need to be reformed and reinvented, not only reformed. And that's makes the issue goes beyond the geography and territory of the river to the sea to be way, way bigger and wider, because it's a global issue again and again. And yes, the fragmentation is definitely a problem. It weakened the Palestinians over the years. In multiple occasions, it would have been avoidable if the Palestinians were stronger and if they prioritized their national goals and the national movements and not their narrow factional politics. So that many things could have been avoidable. But now we have it as a reality, as fragmentation is there, which is to bring different strategies. And honestly, I mean, I'm not trying to do a marketing approach here, but that's the reason why we established Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. And that is an example, it's a micro example, but how can we transform fragmentation from a weakness into a strength? By bringing 200 policy analysts spread all over the world, from Australia and New Zealand to Chile and anywhere in between, with different political hats, with different political views, with different approaches to the question of Palestine. How can we bring that fragmentation and makes it an opportunity, in the sense brings an intellectual, not unified position, but a space for all these conversations to happen, to inform policy. And this is where we have the example here that when these voices come together, they can strategize differently. They can imagine and reimagine differently. And that's the beauty of it. Although it is now more at the intellectual level, maybe at the policy level, but then what is needed is to take it to the political level. Of course, there are different considerations, because politics has different considerations than intellectualism and different and policy analysis and all of that. But again, it is the accountability mechanisms that will ensure if these politicians are accountable to deliver or not. But also it's what kind of incentives is giving to them and what kind of punishment is out there. So if there is a space to strategize, there is a space. If it's happening, it is happening. The question is how it will be implemented in a sustained way that it creates change, because even the best policy, the best strategy in the world cannot just change realities of 30 or 70 years like this very quickly. It's a process, it's an incremental process. And this is why I'm insisting on having a larger national dialogue with clear framework. And then the process, it will be a painful process. It will be incremental process. Just keep in mind that framework or that triangle that I mentioned with the Oslo one. The moment we flip it, the Palestinians will be exhausted because that will be a very difficult process, but they will be energized because they managed to bring a framework that matters for them and for their journey to self-determination and freedom. And this is where they need support from all of us, not to sustain that framework, but flip that triangle and that framework. And the tools are there, including how to link and how to transform fragmentation into a strength rather than a weakness.
Thank you, Ala. That was really a tour de force, because despite the horrific time we live in, somehow you give us some hope. I feel hopeful. I feel optimistic that we can fix things, as you said, as you started by this amazing conclusion that as long as there is an occupation of the Palestinian land, there'll be resistance. The two go together. And also the way you brought us back to the importance of implementing a national dialogue and a Palestinian national dialogue that can draw on the talent of young people. There was one of your slides where you highlighted the importance of the PLO being reinvigorated by bringing youth, young people like yourself, into the equation, young talented Palestinians from around the world, but also most importantly by centering the people, the human capital, and also bringing accountability to the table. I think these are important, and bringing back the security of the Palestinian people, the humanizing thing, because as you said earlier, the securitization of everything except the security of the Palestinian people themselves. So thank you. If you want to offer us one sentence as a concluding remark, we're genuinely grateful.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for the engagement. And thank you for all the important questions. And it is all to be continued. To be
here in Canberra, in person.
Hopefully, with pleasure.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our audience and attendees. And have a good rest of the day, Ala.